Ladies and gentlemen, our next session is about to begin. The session is titled Security or Economics, What Drives Foreign Policy? Our speakers today are Ashraf Jahangir, Qazi Zafar Hilali, Zia Mia, and Raza Rabbani. Ilhan Niaz is our moderator. Ilhan Niaz is a scholar and author who is a professor of history at the Quaid-e-Azam University. His books include Old World Empires, Cultures of Power and Governance in Eurasia, The Culture of Power and Governance of Pakistan, 1947 to 2008, and An Inquiry into the Culture of Power of the Subcontinent.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Can you hear me? No? Hello, can you hear me? All right. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you all so much for being here, and also a very warm thanks to the organizers of this event, the Oxford University Press and the Karachi Literature Festival. Today we'll be talking about Pakistan's foreign policy, and we have a great panel for you. We have Ambassador Ashraf Jahangir Qazi, who is an eminent Pakistani Foreign Service officer, and he has served at various key places, including New Delhi, and he will be talking to us, sharing with us his views on the subject. We have Professor Zia Mia, who is a Princeton physicist, and in case you got a chance to listen to him talk on the first day of the KLF reference climate change and nuclear war, we hope that he'll bring a more scientific perspective to this discussion. And then we have Zafar Hilali Saab, who is another outstanding officer of Pakistan's Foreign Service, who served in various key postings. And he will also be talking about sharing his views on this subject. Now, just to get things started, when I saw the title of this particular session, I felt that when we think about foreign policy, when we think about what drives foreign policy, it's not just a question of security or economics. So there's a bit of a binary that is built into the title of this session, which we don't necessarily have to adhere to as far as the discussion and our deliberations are concerned. There is a lot else that goes into shaping how a country views itself and how a country conducts itself with reference to its neighbors, with reference to the wider world. As a historian, we often focus upon certain persistent factors, factors like geography, factors like demography, factors like, of course, historical experience, the psychosocial conditioning of a people shaped by millennia of such experiences. And all of that goes into determining or influencing how your leadership and how your state structures and social and economic structures respond to these specific challenges that they may face, whether those specific challenges emanate from the security realm or they emanate from the economic realm, or indeed any other particular facet of experience that we might come across. So in that spirit, we'll be looking forward to hearing from our panelists and seeing what they have to say about Pakistan's foreign policy and what drives it or what should drive it. One of the things which I have come across in the course of studying the Pakistani state and examining its thinking is that we are, of course, celebrating 70 years of our presence as an independent country. But in those 70 years, I have not really encountered great intellectual depth as far as our attempt to articulate a coherent national strategy for our country, for its future, for its people, as far as these things are concerned. Too much of our discourse is narrowly driven by events, it is narrowly driven by personalities, it is narrowly driven by specific security or other interests or vectors that influence the rulers of the day. So I would also hope that as we move forward with this panel, we can reflect upon why perhaps we've not done such a great job when it comes to developing a coherent national strategy, a coherent grand strategy for Pakistan and for its people and for its future. So with that, I will ask Ambassador Ashraf Jahangir Qazi to get us started and to share his thoughts on Pakistan's foreign policy.
Oh yeah, it's on. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Moderator or Chairman Ilhan, ladies and gentlemen, Assalamu alaikum. ये हिलता है यार मैं हाथ से पकड़ता हूँ इसलिए अच्छा sorry so Ilhan has set the bar very high expecting us to come up with the kind of depth of thought that we have failed to achieve in 70 years. So one thing you can be certain is that I'm not going to sort of be able to fulfill those expectations, but I shan't fail to try and say something relevant and new, or not new, but something that's relevant and all. What drives foreign policy? You've already given us a fairly good introduction to this subject. Is it security or economic development? Now, if we look at national policy, naturally covers the whole range of what the national interests are, and so a set of national policies would, in that a simple model, sort of add up to policies which reflect the national interest. The question then arises, who determines the national interest? But foreign policy, if we sort of look at foreign policy is essentially an aspect of national policy, that aspect that involves contact of an infinite range with the outside world, with neighbors, with regional countries, with the international community, across the whole range of subjects. So you can say national policy is what drives foreign policy, of which security and economic are two of the most important factors, and plus many others. So and then we do very quickly come to the question of who determines national policy and who drives a national policy. And we notice that in most societies in the world, we keep hearing it, even let's say the United States, you keep hearing of the figure 0.1% of Americans determine policy, and the rest are not properly citizens, they are spectators. They are the recipients of policy, and even if they have views, those views don't necessarily have a decisive role in the fashioning of policies in various respects. Now, to the extent that this is true, many people might wish to challenge this, I essentially believe that this reflects much of the truth. In Pakistan also, we have enormous inequality of influence, economy, and enormous concentration of power and influence, and therefore it's a very small part of the population that controls national policy and therefore controls the direction and essential content of the major features of foreign policy. That's foreign policy towards your most important neighbors or with which you interact, like the United States is there, is the neighbor of everybody because of its global reach. So we have the same problem in Pakistan. Who determines the foreign policy narrative, which is part of the national narrative? It is those who wield power, those institutions that have dominated and continue to dominate. So what do we need to be doing in this respect? Yes, I'll say, we all know, and needs to be spelled out, the military and the intelligence and associate. There's business, there's the so-called feudal elite, there's the bureaucracy, both at the national level, regional level, local levels. All of these add up to, you might, a very small percentage of the entire population. They set the tone, they set the direction, and they essentially sort of set the priorities which are reflected in budget allocations. So we may talk the talk with respect to education, with respect to human resource development, with respect to human rights protections and all, but what matters is who walks the walk. And the walk, and those institutions which have their own interests and which are presented as the national interest, they're the ones who have been most influential. Now, with regard to security and economics, the fact is of the matter is that they are, as Ilhan said, they're not mutually exclusive, they're not necessarily mutually competitive, but when Pakistan came into being, and you look at the historical background and the kind of immediate challenges we faced, the security imperative was supreme, because there was the alleged expectation in India that this is an experiment that's not going to succeed, and there were many others who even thought so, and there were also challenges we faced and all, the exchange of the populations and the violence that accompanied it, the waters dispute, the currency differences. When India devalued its currency, we didn't follow suit, and India didn't recognize. Now they changed value between the 2 rupees. All of these things, and then of course there was the threat even of war over Kashmir. So the security imperative was huge. Pakistan was therefore initially a security state. But it is very apparent that if you remain a security state without transitioning towards also being a development state, the first thing you begin to undermine is your security. Because security is not just facing immediate threats in the immediate and short term, it's also the longer term threat that's faced, and your options with respect to any challenge only develop to the extent that your society develops, your economy develops, your options multiply. And this is something which has eluded Pakistan, and it ultimately led in a sense to the loss of Iqbal's vision and the Quaid-e-Azam's Pakistan, and the Pakistan that was achieved by the Pakistan movement. Inside of 25 years, we lost that Pakistan forever. And afterwards, we had to sort of pick up the pieces, in the words of Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, and sort of make a go of what remained, or rump Pakistan, you might say. But did we learn the lesson of security versus economy? No, we didn't. We continued to be a security state. Why? Because the class interests and the power structures remained unchanged. And therefore, we are now where we are as a result of, and because I don't want to take up too much time, we'll have a conversation also. We are where we are because despite the fact that we pay obeisance in our rhetoric to the development imperative, our structure does not allow us to move too far away from being a Praetorian state, security state, even though we have never been successful at war, but nonetheless we bury commission reports, we learn nothing from our setbacks, and so the narrative remains by and large unchanged, and the narrative is always fashioned by those power centers, kinetic power centers and institutions that determine the national interest and therefore even the foreign policy direction in service to that national interest. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir. I now ask Dr. Zia. मैं इस पैनलिस्ट बात कर लें प्लीज़, पैनलिस्ट बात कर लें, फिर आप सवाल पूछ लें, पैनलिस्ट बात कर लें, फिर आप उनसे सवाल कर रहे हैं, पैनलिस्ट बात कर लें, फिर आप सवाल पूछ लें, इफ़ यू डोंट माइंड. वो ठीक, आप
क्या इंग्लिश ज़बान की बात है तो आप शुरू में फरमाते. हाँ
जी, Ziasa,
but-
if you could please. Yes.
Me?
Yes. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So, thank you. I agree with many of the things that Qazi Saab has already said. That it's not just a matter of what drives foreign policy. As if security or economics are engines in your car, moving it forward. It's also important who drives foreign policy. So, and he talked about institutions and power centers and, a ruling class, to use an old word. So all of that is true, but let me try and add a few more things. One is that individuals matter, not just institutions, in determining not just foreign policy, but all policy. And so one of the things that you can see when you look at the history of Pakistani foreign policy is the enormous and at times absolutely decisive effect that key individuals have played in determining enormous events of enormous historical proportion. And the first, of course, are the generals who made coups. Right? They took power as individuals, but the fact that it was successful was because the institution followed them. And the fact that the military regimes that Pakistan has had have been so different in their texture and their character speaks to the people, the individuals, who are at the helm of those institutions. There's a fundamental difference between the military regime of Ayub Khan versus Ziaul Haq versus Pervez Musharraf. So it's not just that you have the military as an institution determining policy, the individuals matter. Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, as an individual mattered enormously in shaping policy, whether it was the 1965 war, whether it was 1971, whether it was the nuclear weapons program. As an individual, he was of enormous significance in determining foreign policy. So when you think about why individuals matter, how is it that the fate of an entire country of now 200 million people can be at the mercy of one person? Is something that I think we need to think about. Because if individuals can be of such enormous significance, that tells you that we lack a system of institutional constraints and political constraints that are able to prevent any one person from having such massive power. This is not unique to Pakistan, of course. But since we're talking about Pakistan, we do have a democratic deficit in Pakistan. That means that we live in fear, at least those of us who are committed to the democratic process, live in fear of the next general who decides that he is going to be the savior. Whether it's all the pictures of Raheel Sharif along the highway, or the next one who decides that I will save the country from itself. So we need to focus on those issues as well as these large issues of security, because if a person is in charge can decide fundamental questions, then security policy and economic policy are at the whim of one person, and then who that one person is matters in the absence of checks and balances. The second thing I want to talk about is the role of that other people also get to drive your foreign policy. It's not just you that gets to decide. It's like driving your car on the highway. There are other drivers in other cars, which mean that you have to make decisions that you had not anticipated. You have to make choices that you haven't planned. You have to make up entirely new policies that were never part of your imagination. And so, and it's not just that, Pakistan reaches out to the world, to its neighbors and to other countries and says, this is what we are trying to do and this is how we're going to try and do it, as if we are the only ones with power and influence in this process. Others have power and influence. And right now we have an enormous set of effects driving Pakistani foreign policy that are not within the control of Pakistan. The Chinese will get to decide how much money goes where with CPEC, not Pakistan. tomorrow the Chinese may decide enough, thank you very much, we're going to move our money to somewhere else. So much for having control of your economic policy or your foreign policy. You know? And we live in fear that tomorrow the Americans will declare Pakistan to be a terrorist state and there will be sanctions. That's for them to decide. So it's not just we that get to decide and our institutions that get to decide. Everybody else also has power, and in many cases they have more power over our policy than we do. You have to be honest about this. The third thing I think that is important to keep in mind is that even within Pakistan, all policies are contested. Whether it's economic policy or it's security policy, there is not one policy and one set of understandings of what is it we're trying to do. There are deep divisions within institutions, within society, and within the ruling class. It's clear in Pakistan, you can see there is now a pro-China faction and a pro-American faction. Right? You can see it absolutely. But similarly, when Pakistan was trying to do its security policy and its economic policy in the 1960s, we end up with 1971. Because you saw divisions within Pakistan about what security and economics meant. And now we have the same situation, with Balochistan and with the jihad, right? There are people who are contesting and pushing for other ways of framing the question of security policy and of economic policy and of foreign policy. And so the idea that there is one set of institutions or one policy is just not on. And especially in a case like Pakistan, where we have no process of arriving at legitimate consensus. What you have is that you have authoritarian policy making, that once policy is determined, it is held rigidly even when it is contested until it breaks down. And so I think that what I want to conclude with is making a case that thinking of policy, and especially foreign policy in a place like Pakistan, in rational terms of institutions and elites and self-interest is all perfectly true and proper. But that set of analyses applies to almost every country. What also matters is the role of individuals who can be very irrational. What matters is everybody else and the balance of powers and interests that are at play. And lastly, this question of the internal divisions and contestations within Pakistan that mean that any policy is actually always fragile because we don't actually agree on so many things about what it is that Pakistan is and is not in its identity and in its efforts to try and move forward.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Riyasat. I'll now request Ambassador Hilali to please share with us his thoughts on Pakistan's foreign policy.
Security or economics, what drives foreign policy? Well, the short answer is both and more. Security, because the good management of geostrategic location bolsters the ability to withstand military challenges, and economics, because poverty, hunger, and unemployment enhance vulnerabilities and weaken the national will. Of course, there are other compulsions. Our ideological tilt, for example, we tend to look kindly on other Muslim states, even though these states are often at each other's throats, and sometimes at ours too. Instead of accepting this reality, we plunge ahead, continuing to invent excuses and deceptions. For instance, look at the present state of our relations with the UAE. Because we refuse to join their coalition against Yemen, their policy towards Pakistan has undergone a metamorphosis. The UAE announced its complete support of India in the matter of the fictional surgical strikes India allegedly conducted against Pakistan recently. As if that was not enough, they concluded a series of defense agreements with India, including one promising the use of their respective ports in case of war. There has not been a word from our government. That's because I think our leaders need a haven to park themselves and their ill-gotten gains in the UAE. Whenever they are deposed. Why else would we have not said a word against the UAE, which is in reality nothing more than an American petrol station in the Gulf? With regard to economics, some hard economic thinking would do us a world of good. It would help get our policy right by imparting discipline to our wayward and disorganized political thinking. Who does not know that we need to cut our dependence on foreign aid and handouts and to generate large-scale investments? But instead of concentrating on that, we are practicing voodoo economics. Where else in the world have you heard a prime minister say our currency is strong and getting stronger, while the economy goes into meltdown and exports actually decline? A weak economy but a strong currency, does that make sense to you? Consider another stupidity. Even as we maintained our relations with the Taliban post-2001, we thought we could still form part of the Western alliance against them. And what is more, maintain good relations with Kabul. Needless to say, we came a cropper. The world laughed at our naivety and abhorred our duplicity. We paid a heavy price for such faulty thinking. We just don't seem to get it. Has not Pakistan's external environment changed to our detriment? What are we to make of the linkages that have sprung up around us, like the US-India strategic relationship, the US-Afghanistan bilateral strategic agreement, Indo-Iran strategic ties? What are these arrangements, if not inter alia meant to strangle and disarm a recalcitrant nuclear Pakistan when the time comes? There have always been two fundamental problems undergoing Pak-US relations. First, instead of a broad partnership that includes trade and cultural linkages, the two countries have a one-dimensional transactional relationship centered along security concerns. Second, we have clashing security interests vis-à-vis India, the Afghan Taliban, and Indian involvement in Afghanistan. These problems will not yield to quick fixes. Surely, therefore, the time has come to question the importance of the American alliance and the temptation to hang on to it. Indeed, the price tag has grown more exorbitant, while our capacity to foot the bill in terms of reciprocity has shrunk further. In short, the alliance is turning out to look like a luxury we can ill afford. I believe that the longer we remain tethered to the Americans, the greater the chances of deeper ruin. The need to cut our losses and free ourselves from an embrace that has in any case become suffocating one is no longer in any doubt. Although admittedly, untangling ourselves from the alliance will require far more dexterity and skill than we have been shown to possess. Let me just conclude by saying that I realize some of you will say, things are not as bleak as I paint them, and they may brand me a Cassandra. After all, we have a strong army, nuclear weapons, etc. We just can't melt and flow down the drain. Well, the Soviet Union had all that, and it had something more, 10 million barrels of oil every day. And it still collapsed. As for Cassandra, don't forget historically, he was proved right.
Thank you, Hilali-san. And what we'll now do is that we'll take questions from the audience. We have approximately half an hour, if I'm not mistaken. Is that correct? Is that correct? All right. So we have approximately half an hour. I would request you to kindly keep the question or comment as short as possible so that we can get maximum number of people to ask questions or to share their thoughts with the panel. All right. Sir, please. Please. Please.
I think our foreign policy was sold by Mr. Liaquat Ali Khan when he went to USA. And in his speech, he declared Russia a dark force. Sir, Ziamia, what is your opinion about my question?
Okay, I can repeat the question. The question was that Liaquat Ali Khan went to the United States to build a relationship and a foreign policy of Pakistan based on a relationship with the United States, as part of which he described the Soviet Union as a dark force. And what do I think of this? Blame it all on Liaquat Ali Khan. There is no doubt that the American ally of choice in South Asia from the very beginning was India, not Pakistan. That was the United States for a while didn't even have an ambassador in Pakistan because Pakistan wasn't important enough. The goal was to recruit India into the Cold War alliance. They tried to get Jawaharlal Nehru to agree, and Nehru very famously went to the United States and told them, India did not become independent to become part of your imperial project. Whereas the Pakistanis said, sir, we are with you. Right? And the first agreement that was signed between Pakistan and the United States was a military assistance agreement. And we have carried the burden of that ever since for the simple reason that the goal of this military assistance agreement was to build up the army of Pakistan as an instrument of American policy in the Cold War, which served the interests of the Pakistan army because it got bigger and it got money and modern weapons. It served the interests of the United States. Didn't do much for anybody else. But once you've done that, there's no taking it back because you've already changed the balance of power within Pakistani society and the Americans are always there. So absolutely, this is a problem that we've had from the beginning. And I think that, you don't have to blame it just on Liaquat. After all, if you actually look back in the historical record, Mr. Jinnah actually asked the Americans for aid, for military aid. So this has been a problem that Pakistan has had from the beginning. And if you now want to say, oh, the relationship with the Americans is now toxic and poisonous and self-destructive, well, we did this to ourselves. A relationship with the Chinese is not guaranteed to be any better. And in many ways, it may actually be worse. And you need to think about that element of it also.
Yes, please, sir. Yes, please.
Thank you. I believe the title should have been What Ails Pakistan's Foreign Policy rather than What Drives Pakistan Foreign Policy. And Sahibzada Yaqub Khan at a talk, it was a state-of-art talk at AKU about 10 years back. It was on imagination. So I asked this question, what ails Pakistan foreign policy? Unka bada mukhtasar jawab tha, सारे जहां का दर्द हमारे जिगर में है. Thank you.
Maybe it's driven by what it is ailed by as well. Yes, please. Right there. इनका हाथ खड़ा है. जी.
Assalamu alaikum, Hilali Sahab. I have a question for you. Throughout Muslim history, we see that the security aspect has dominated our foreign policy, the foreign policies of Muslim countries, from the rightly guided caliphs to the Mughal Empire to the different invaders that we saw. Muslims have always been good at wealth plundering, the looting of wealth, but not at wealth creation. So do you foresee that in the near future, this economics aspect of foreign policy will come to dominate the security element as far as the Muslim countries are concerned? Thank you.
Well, I certainly don't agree with the first part of what you said. And I don't think that Muslims alone were preoccupied by the military aspect. I think all empires or all people, when they come to power, what do you think the Romans did? What did the Mongols do? My God. And they weren't Muslims. What I would say is that we've got to live in the age that we live. And, you know, saying that we were a security state, well, why the hell not, damn it? Nehru gave us 25 years at the most. And before that had elapsed, we lost half the country. I mean, why should we not be preoccupied by defense? I just don't understand. What did you expect the people of Pakistan to do? To say, oh, we separated in a welter of blood? I mean, the killings were unimaginable. And after that, we were threatened with the undoing of Pakistan, and people asked that we were preoccupied by our defense considerations. Why not, damn it? If you're not alive, what difference does it make what else people say? So, I really believe what we did wrong, of course, was overdo it. We shouldn't have done what we did. We shouldn't indeed have acted as the Americans paw in our relations with, a cat's paw, so to speak. But I think initially, Jinnah was concerned about our survival. The day we came into existence, Kashmir went, and within a couple of decades, the other part went. Now, of course, we weren't perfect. A lot of mistakes were made. But I think the malevolence with which India ceded Pakistan, what do they say? It's the Bharat Mata, the complete, the division of Bharat Mata. And even today, Modi is there because in the back of the Indian mind, there is that feeling that he is the man who may well reunite India again. When they talk about Pakistan, his interior minister talked about Pakistan should be allowed to vote whether they wanted to rejoin India. What does that show? That's their subconscious at work, that one day they will come back, or we will have to get them back. No, I'm afraid that I don't want to make excuses for the leaders that went before us. They were as good as bad as, well, actually probably better than the ones we have. But anyway, nevertheless, somebody should speak up for them. Thank you.
Qazi Sahib, could you please also weigh in?
I make a very brief comment on my friend and colleague's response to the question. I do believe it's absolutely right to say, and I did say it in my opening remarks, that Pakistan was born into an ocean of circumstances which threatened our survival, and therefore we had to be a security state in order to survive. Indian hostility over the past 70 years has been a given. It's been it's the parameter within which we have to respond efficiently in terms of our people's interests. So even though we are able, in the long run, to probably have some kind of influence over India's policies towards us. But when it comes to planning, you should always plan for the worst case, as has been, as a given. All right. So in order to be efficient, we need to maximize our options. You cannot maximize your option when your major adversary is 7 times your size and you are being the security state par excellence. Why not multiplying your options through becoming also a development state, without which you cannot cater to the multi-dimensional nature of the security threat that faces Pakistan. So as a result of being a security state, we have always been insecure, and we don't have a very celebrated record on the battlefield vis-a-vis India. Now, because we have had a single-dimensional response to a multi-dimensional challenge. I do think while the security aspect is always relevant to Pakistan as a smaller country, but we are also seek to change the status quo with India with respect to Kashmir, where the balance of justice is in our favor or in the favor of our position rather than India's. So the security aspect adheres, it remains. but you cannot frame an efficient policy on the basis of one-dimensional response. You have to multiply the challenges by becoming a development state, which we have failed to do. We used to, the Hindu rate of growth was supposed to be the 1.5, 2.5%, and the Pakistani rate was 6%, even though it was externally supported rather than generated from within our own economic strength. And that was one of the benefits of Pactitis. But in recent decades, we have adopted the Hindu rate of growth, which is marginally above the population rate of growth, whereas since 1991, India has adopted what was then the Pakistani growth of rate and rate of growth, and which many experts thought in 40 years' time would make Pakistan one of the shining stars of Asia if it grew at that rate for the next 40 years. But we are where we are largely because we have overstressed, and Zafar has just mentioned that there has been an overstress, but it's been really to the point of perversity, overstressed security in both our internal and external policies, and which have proved counterproductive, and we are unable to respond creatively and imaginatively to this particular challenge. That's the problem confronting us.
Ziasa, if you could just weigh in a bit.
I was struck by Qazi Saab's use of the word perversity. This is a very useful category when thinking about Pakistani policy. And in particular, when we think about the relationship with India and this discussion we've been having about security and being a security state, Pakistan has never done anything more perverse than build nuclear weapons as a way to defend itself. Because this is the one thing that is guaranteed to destroy Pakistan if we actually get into a war. There can be no greater perversion of your sense of seeking security than to build a system that will kill us all. So if you ask yourself the question that in its endless search for security in what it sees as a hostile setting, Pakistan eventually ends up with a situation where it is willing to start nuclear war, which will end with the death of millions and tens of millions of Pakistanis. The question is, what political goal has your security policy actually achieved when all of your cities are burning radioactive ruins? Nothing is worth that.
Yes, please. Lady in the front row.
This is, in the face of the Washington consensus, can you be anything other than a security state? Because by nature, the Washington consensus is designed to subvert economics.
Washington consensus is economics.
Yeah. Sir, would you like to?
Who's it addressed to?
Generally the panel? Sir?
Well, as far as I know, the phrase or the media phrase of Washington consensus refers to an economic strategy which tends to sort of work to the advantage of, the capitalist order. Or you sort of reduce your spending, and you sort of, adopt austerity programs, and all of that. The critics allege go in favor of those who've given you loans and the paying back of those loans, and at the expense of the development of your own people. So the Washington consensus has come under a lot of challenge. But you seem to be using it in a strategic sense. So in that context, the Washington consensus does need to be modified after see what is Washington consensus, I think, requires it to be challenged by becoming a development state. Because if you're a security state, you're going to be economically dependent on those who are giving you loans. You don't even our nuclear capability, which Ziad talked about, our nuclear capability was really generated by our getting technology from abroad. It wasn't generated so much from our own economic standing. So it was generated from abroad, and we don't have the industrial basis really to get into a race, an escalatory race, a technological race where you upgrade things. After all, we're looking at how to preserve a second strike capability when India is planning its nuclear program with respect to China, not with respect to Pakistan, so it says. And it probably is true, because they still remember 1962. So we put ourselves in a very difficult position when we are sort of trying to compete with India from the basis of a smaller economy. And, that's what undermined the Soviet Union ultimately, that America sort of drew it into an arms race, which ultimately sort of proved too much for the Russian economy. We must beware of being drawn into such things whereby the stress on our economy is much larger. This happened when the nuclear tests were done. We knew India would be sanctioned, Pakistan would be sanctioned. In 1965, similarly, India sanctioned both countries. Each time the pressure on Pakistan was many times more than the pressure on India. So we have to sort of look at our challenges in a much deeper and broader context in order to choose the efficient path towards our objectives, which is economic and military security.
And if I may also say so in a simpler context, there was an old argument in Britain whether you'd rather be red or dead. What does that mean? Whether you had the nuclear weapons to ward off the Soviet Red Army, in other words, whether you'd be red because there was no other defense but nuclear to them, or you'd rather be dead.
But this was a choice.
And I think that this is I don't for a single minute think that if we did not have the nuclear weapon, India would not by now have gobbled up large parts of Pakistan. And quite frankly, I mean, to think anything else with Modi. I mean, look at the situation of the Muslims in India. He's creating another Pakistan within India. And I'm not saying that. Christians are saying that. Human rights people are saying that. I mean, is there a point of time that you would not rather be dead than alive? Well, in that case, I frankly would rather be dead than live in Modi's India. And I'm sorry. And
just one sentence.
And I just don't know why we try to be rational about these things. And by the way, this question about going under economically, we've kept it to the irreducible minimum defense. If we didn't have that, for God's sake, the Indian army can wipe the floor in 2 weeks because of the strength that they have. Didn't you see? I mean, what was the great thing they did in East Pakistan? 15-1 odds, and we had no air force. It was... So let's get real, I think. If you want to survive as an independent nation, you've got to have the nuclear weapon as long as your adversary is India.
Very briefly, I do agree with Zafar that nuclear deterrence is what we do require in order to sort of try and overcome the conventional imbalance, although I also subscribe to what Zia says and the dangers that decision sort of has. But the fact is that once we proceed to tactical nuclear weapons, we're in danger of making our nuclear capability not just a deterrent factor but an operational factor. That is fatal for Pakistan, because nuclear deterrence of course credibly must imply the possible use of it in some ultimate scenario. But if you do it in a scenario which is far short of the ultimate scenario, you are then going to buy a lot of trouble, because tactical nuclear weapons inevitably are going to draw a response which may not be tactical. There is no agreement that a response to a tactical use of weapons has to be confined to tactical. In fact, India has gone out of its way to say it would respond to any kind, even the use of tactical nuclear weapons on Indian troops inside Pakistan territory would trigger from them a nuclear response of the kind that they choose to. So we need to make that. We need the nuclear deterrence. We don't need nuclear operability apart from the deterrence.
I just want to say something. Sorry, I'm just. Do you know when the Mumbai attack took place, and frankly, there was talk of nuclear war. The Indian Stock Exchange lost, or the Bombay Stock Exchange lost $8 billion. That's how much foreigners withdrew their money. Nobody wants to go to a place which might blow up in a nuclear holocaust. Now, I really do believe that if the Indians keep up this pressure on us, promote terrorism, finance Balochistan, promote the TTP, keep doing, tell the Afghans that we are your real proxy, you are our real proxy, I think they'll make economic development very difficult in Pakistan. So I think that now you really have to fashion a policy which suggests an element of brinkmanship. Now, everybody will say this is an awful thing to say, but you've got to think about that. Because if they don't let you develop, if they keep you destabilized, then you've got to strike back in some way that will make them think 10 times before wanting to do that to you. And the only way that you can do that, I think, quite frankly, you have strategic weapons, operationalize them. Move them up if necessary. That doesn't mean you should be irresponsible and fire. But if you see troops massing for an attack, do you honestly believe if you see the Indian divisions line up for attacking Pakistan, you should not consider the use of operational tactical nuclear weapons? Of course you should. Why not? Why are they there for? You use it or you lose it.
So,
I have a... Excuse me?
Just 1 second. This argument, why are they there if you can't use them? This is the argument that Donald Trump is now using.
I just want some suggestions from the panel. What do you suggest? How should Pakistan move forward in its foreign policy? That's what I want to hear. 3 points, maybe. 3 main points.
Well,
how should we move forward?
Great, because we've got 3 panelists.
Okay. Very briefly, you want what, 3 points or the 3 of us to speak?
3 points, anybody can give them, that how should we move forward as a country that will...
Total 9 points we
Something good for us.
Well, I don't know if I can make 3 of the 9 points, but nonetheless, I'll give it a try. Number one, security-wise, you've got to move towards becoming a development state because that provides you more comprehensive security. Very, very much apart from multiplying your options with regard to the challenges you already face and will continue to face. Number 2, 2050 is approaching. Your population today is past 200 million. You will be 400 million. Are you making any preparations for that in terms of education, in terms of human resource development, in terms of healthcare? You're doing nothing. No nuclear weapons are going to save you from the outcome if you ignore these absolute priorities. And number 3, you have to have a political system which communicates with its people. Otherwise, it becomes an elitist system which works against the national interest.
Would you like to? Please, sir.
Sir Rani Sahab, with all my friendship with you, I must respectfully disagree. You said you would rather be dead than live in in Modi's India. You said you'd rather be dead rather than live in Modi's India. But consider the fact that they don't kill Muslims on the scale that we have killed Muslims here in Pakistan. You would be dead if you were a Baloch today asking for your rights in Pakistan. You, as a Muslim in India, have far more rights than Muslims living in Pakistan. Second, on your issue of nuclear weapons and why we should use them. Well, we have used them, didn't we? To wage Kargil, to do Mumbai, to carry out terrorist attacks in India under the nuclear umbrella. We've done it again and again. And you would be lying to yourself if you said, we have not used the nuclear shield. We have.
Well, let me just respond very briefly to all those, Mr. Hoodboy, who is indeed a man I respect greatly. I think the best propaganda is the one that has the element of truth about it. All that he says is excellent anti-nuclear propaganda because it does have an element of truth about it. But that doesn't mean it's the whole truth. Thank you.
May I pose a question,
Can you
sir?
get that gentleman from the back?
I have a question here. Here.
Where are you?
I'm standing right here, sir. My question, sir, was about these surgical strikes or the so-called surgical strikes. To me, it really doesn't matter whether they did take place or did not. What is most alarming has been that such a muted response from the rest of the world. Now, this is really a scary part. I wonder what our panel would have to say about those surgical strikes.
Well, if I may, I
please,
mentioned
after
it, so
you.
let me go first very briefly. You know, I don't think... The Indians, why didn't they carry out? What they have long planned to do is an attack on Muridke. Why didn't they send a few paratroops down in Muridke and blow up some training facility for the... Which Lashkar is there? Tayyaba, whichever it is, I don't know. The fact of the matter is that that may have triggered a war. And what scares the Indians about a war with Pakistan? My God, their army is dying to go. They can't lose, they say, except for the nuclear factor. Please understand. Now, everything is terrible about the nuclear weapons, except when it comes to India, it seems to have bought us. It will not be the answer, of course not. But it may buy us time to do what Ashraf says we should be doing. Rather than have stupid Indians and stupid Pakistanis fighting each other with the hope that the stupid Indians saying we will win, the nuclear factor has kept them on their side of the border, given us an opportunity to develop and to frame and chart policies that may still save Pakistan. Nothing else.
Assalamu alaikum. This honorable panel has not commented on a reality that has been stated by the Foreign Office of Pakistan recently, that our foreign policy really depends upon the migratory birds which come from Russia and which are forwarded to Arab sheikhs for killing in Pakistani deserts. And that has become the cornerstone of our foreign policy and not security and economics. Thank you.
Okay. We have time for one more comment. Ji.
Yes, sir. This question is with Mr. Ashraf Jahangir Qazi and Mr. Hilali, Ambassador Hilali. Sir, I would like to know, because you have walked in the corridors of power and surely you still do, it looks like, especially from Mr. Zafar Hilali's conversations and comments. Sir, do you realize, does our establishment realize that today Pakistan is one of the most isolated nations after North Korea? In business, our people do not get a visa today even to small African countries, unless you know somebody, unless you are one of the corridors of power. If a businessman wants to invite a German, a French, a European, an American to buy a machinery, to service a machinery, to transfer technology, they're not given a visa because of security, so-called security. This conference, this literature festival is testimony how few foreigners are there. It's not just the Americans or the Indians, Sri Lankans, Iranians, Afghanis, Bangladeshis, they all are our enemies. Does the establishment realize that we are now an isolated nation? This is what the establishment has driven us to.
Sir, if you could.
I have the the great privilege of being a free person after my retirement from government service. Otherwise, I would have had to answer to that question as a member of the establishment. I'm no longer that. And when one was a member of the establishment, one tried to be as frank and as helpful as possible, but that was always within the privacy of communications within the Foreign Office, etc., when I was a member of it. Now, I can tell you, the fact is, yes, we are isolated. One of the reasons is because of our overemphasis or one-dimensional concept of national security. And therefore, in our foreign policies, there's been a tendency to always look for equalizers. Now, the equalizers have varied from America to China, to after the Bangladesh, to the Islamic world, to becoming a nuclear weapons power, and even to have proxies, who can do the kinds of things that the state can say, we are not doing it. It's like the Communist Party of Russia would say, we aren't doing things, there's Comintern or some other organization, we don't do these things. Now, nobody ever bought into that. We have a number of proxy assets, who, I don't know who it is in Pakistan, some segment of the establishment looks upon them as assets. These are enormous liabilities if you look at the costs and which you've referred to in terms of isolation of Pakistan, lack of economic growth, lack of investment, and therefore with 2050 arriving where we're not even beginning to do the things in order to cope with these challenges. What do? We begin to reset our priorities. How can we do it? Don't look towards the establishment. The people have to realize that they have the power. And if they don't choose, no, I'm sorry, you're shaking your head, but you're wrong. The only source of reform in Pakistan is radical reform, movements, and they can only come from the people when they realize. Noam Chomsky said, don't speak the truth to the establishment. The establishment already knows the truth and enjoys it. You have to speak the truth to each other in order to realize your power and change things.
Now, I tell you, I think an excellent answer.
That's why I'm saying there's no answer there.
Can I just finish?
Sure, please, and then we'll conclude.
What was I going to say? An excellent answer. Every word of what he says, I subscribe to it. The fundos are a huge problem. I totally agree with you. But you see, and we know why we are supporting the fundos, and I think that's a huge and a very big mistake. You may not know this, but I was attached to Benazir Bhutto for 3 years, and I was fortunate in that I was not only attached to us because I was the special secretary in charge of foreign affairs, etc., etc. We became friends in a sense, so we were very frank and free with each other. And we all knew what was wrong with our policies. We all knew that the antediluvian Taliban were never going to be what we wanted or would be good for us. But there was a segment of opinion in Pakistan, and certainly in power in Pakistan, which felt that they were useful. And we had hundreds of discussions on this, and they said they brought peace to Afghanistan, and therefore there was peace at our borders. Yes, it was the peace of the grave, but nevertheless, in a sense, there was peace. Look, absolutely, Ashraf, what Ashraf has said is correct. I think that I work for a channel. I have restraints and constraints. There are no-nos when you talk on television. Don't think that I can go out and say free. And when you do talk freely, you get threatened. You get violent threats. These are unpleasant threats. But in our own way, the people who you think are sort of conservative and pro-establishment, let me tell you that they too are doing their bit. And inshallah, I think slowly, gradually, as democracy grows, as democracy takes root, we will be a better country than we are at the moment.
All right. I would like to thank everyone. We are out of time. Reference this particular panel. If I could just sum up what has been said in one sentence, is that basically we seem to know better, but we do worse. And if we can try and close that gap, Pakistan may be perhaps a better, a more secure, and a more prosperous state. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you. Thanks, sir.